Please be seated. And are there children who are wanting to join me up here for Kingdom Time? Come on up and have a seat. Yeah. Come on up. Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Come on. You guys can even sit over here. Up here by me. Just go too far. Come on up. Wow, what a crowd. Nope. Wow. You all can sit in closer, too, so that you can hear you. People don't have to hide around the back corner. Here, there's room. Come have a seat. So, have any of you guys ever been blamed for something that you didn't do? Yep. Somebody else spilled the juice or the milk. Somebody else knocked over the lamp. Maybe your brother or your sister, but your mom and your dad yelled at you for it instead. Mm-hmm. Or maybe sometime that you did something really good and somebody else got credit for it. Happened to you, yeah. You're the one who picks up the toys and your brother or sister gets the credit for it, right? Life is not fair. I hate to tell you that as you grow up, it's going to keep being not fair. The not fairness gets bigger as you become adults. But it still happens. There are going to be times when you get blamed for things that are not your fault. There are going to be times when somebody else gets the credit when you were the one who put in all of the hard work. The good news of the gospel is that God never blames us when it's not our fault. In fact, God doesn't blame us at all. And God certainly doesn't need for us to earn God's love, because that love is given to each of us even before we have a chance to do all of those good things that we might want to do just in order to get appreciation. We, all of us, as we grow up, have to go out into a world where people will try to convince us that it's not the way we're learning it is in God's kingdom. They'll try to convince us that it's okay to blame each other. They will try to convince us that the only way to be loved is to earn that love by being good enough. The important thing, though, is to remember that each one of you is already seen by God as good enough, more than good enough, lovable, regardless of what you do or do not do. And as the world tries to convince you otherwise, remember that love so that when you become grown-ups, when you become the people sitting where I am and where your parents and grandparents are, that you can teach that to the next generation of kids. That God's love is already big enough for every one of us. Okay? Now, who wants a stamp? I knew that was the part they were waiting for. All right, guys, back up. Back up. Get in line. You guys are all over here. Get in line. There we go. All right, first hand. There we go. There you go. And that is a cool airplane. One to a customer. One each. You've already got one. There you go. There you go. Oops. There you go. The parable that we have just heard in our gospel lesson today, commonly called the parable of the unjust manager, or if you're a King James Bible type person, the unjust steward, is one of the most difficult and confusing teachings we ever encounter from Jesus anywhere in the four Gospels. On the surface of this parable, Jesus appears to be commending an immoral person and telling us to act like him. Jesus actually seems to commend someone for cheating his boss. I've read Bible commentaries where people think that this is really what Jesus is doing. And people have used this parable over the years to justify all sorts of dishonest behavior in their business dealings. The only problem with this interpretation is that Jesus knew the strong justice tradition of the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah begins his oracles by telling us, "Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice." The prophet Micah asks us, "What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" Amos gives us the line that has inspired so many: "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." And Jeremiah, from whom we heard this morning, will go on in later chapters to address the kings of Judah and say, "Do justice, act righteously, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor anyone who has been robbed." It's important for us to know that in this tradition of the prophets, justice has very little to do with getting what you have coming to you. Justice is not about meting out punishment for bad behavior or about giving rewards for good behavior. Rather, justice is about ordering society so that everyone has what he or she needs to thrive. Justice is chiefly an economic concept. Justice is especially concerned for the poor and powerless, and makes their care a touchstone of what it means to follow God. The prophets tell us over and over what God has to say about economic dishonesty. They tell us that God has no tolerance for those who cheat and swindle. Those who make their wealth by dishonest means are not followers of God. Indeed, those who cheat and swindle and exploit are active opponents of God's way of justice. Jesus knows this prophetic tradition of justice. Jesus came to fulfill this tradition. He stands in it as a prophet himself, calling all of us away from the world's dishonesty and exploitation and back to God and God's justice. So we can't be satisfied with the surface of the parable. Whatever Jesus is doing, he is not praising cheats and frauds. So what do we do with this parable then? maybe it would help to know a little bit about how Jesus' first audiences might have heard it. In Jesus' time, the wealthiest members of the upper class would often have great land holdings that were located far, far away from their primary residences. Much like today, the rich and the powerful lived in the centers of power, the Londons or the New Yorks of their time. And they simply were not able to administer their properties and all of the income associated with them. So they would hire managers. These managers had authority to make contracts, to loan money, to buy and sell assets, all without ever seeking the approval of the landowner. In short, they could do anything necessary to make the rich person's holdings grow. And on top of all of this, they were allowed to use their employer's money to make money for themselves. They didn't just earn a salary or a set percentage off of their employer's gains. Instead, they often added large sums of money onto the bill for those who were doing business with their employers. Sort of an under-the-table kind of a thing. If tenants wanted to continue to rent land, if farmers wanted to continue to sell produce, if merchants wanted to continue to purchase goods, if persons wanted to continue to be able to borrow money, then they had, in effect, they had to bribe the manager in order to be allowed the privilege. And this was not considered an unethical practice. It was simply the norm of doing business. And a skillful manager could become quite wealthy. So when Jesus describes the manager as a squanderer of the owner's property, he's describing something different than the embezzlement that we might think of today. Maybe the manager failed to vigorously press the owner's advantage in the marketplace. Or he could simply be the victim of an unfounded accusation from a jealous tenant or an angry customer, someone who was simply upset over that last bribe that they had to pay. But whatever the reason, the owner has decided to fire the manager, and we can only assume that it's a done deal. That is, after all, what the manager assumes. And fearing a loss of station, or worse yet, starvation, the manager responds by putting his employer between a rock and a hard place. Before turning the books over to his boss, the manager reduces the amounts owed by the debtors by very substantial amounts, anywhere from 20 to 50%. And his boss is pretty much stuck with accepting the loss. If the rich man honors the remission of debts, then he appears to be a magnanimous benefactor of the lower classes. But if the rich man attempts to nullify the changes made by his manager, then not only does he breed ill will with his tenants and clients, but he also appears weak. Nullifying the changes would indicate that he never had any control over his manager. And if the rich man is to honor the dealings of the manager, then he also needs to continue to employ the manager in order to show that the rich man's authority was behind the deals all along. The manager has been shrewd indeed. He's gotten the best of his employer, and apparently he has saved his own skin. Now, because of the ways in which this parable rubs up against the traditions of the prophets, we can be pretty certain that it isn't an instruction about building monetary wealth. Monetary systems are always in some way based on the idea that there is a limited amount of wealth. That if some have it, then others can't have it. If our focus is on acquiring wealth for ourselves, then we're going to have a very, very hard time walking in the ways of God's justice. That is where the manager is at the beginning of the parable. He's a cheat. He's exploited tenants and trading partners. He's used his employer's wealth for his own betterment and only dealt with others in ways that benefited himself and maybe, at times, his boss. His concern has never been for a society in which everyone can thrive. But what if the parable is not about a man cheating his boss, but about the discovery of justice? You see, when the manager was facing his own dismissal, he also realized that he had done nothing over the years to build a society that cares for those with little power. He had only been focused on his own wealth. But when he was about to join the ranks of the powerless, he had to face that the worldly economic system of which he had been such a big part did not create an environment where all could thrive. He starts out to save his own skin, to buy himself some favor with those who have less power than he does, but who are soon to have more. But what if, on the way, he discovers something better than a safety net? What if he discovers that in God's system of justice, there is enough wealth to go around? He can engage in economic dealings that benefit everyone, not just himself. After all, after remitting all of those debts, his boss is still going to continue to be a very wealthy man, but those farmers and olive growers might have just a little bit more to support themselves and their own families. And when the manager acts this way, even he comes out all right. We live in a society that tells us to buy, to accumulate, to build our wealth and our personal status. And I dare say that most of us here in this place this morning are probably doing quite well by those standards. But all around us, there are those who just aren't making it. There are people who go to bed hungry, and others who don't get adequate medical care, and others facing the loss of their homes. The society in which we live is not a just one by God's standards. Far too many people simply cannot thrive in the world in which we live. These are tough economic times. And the fear of ending up as one of those needy people causes many in our society to oppose changes that could help those in need. We look out first and foremost for number one, for ourselves, and we leave the others to fend for themselves. In our economy, there isn't enough to go around, so we protect what is our own. But the good news for us today is that, like the manager, we can discover that in God's economy, there really is enough to go around. God's justice can provide space for all of God's children to not merely survive, but to thrive. That can be a hard thing to accept. But if we do, then maybe like the manager in the parable, we can end up receiving praise when we expected rebuke. maybe we can learn to trust that where God has provided for us, God has done so that we might do the same for others. I think that there's a better name for our parable this morning than the parable of the unjust manager. I think maybe the parable ought to be called the manager who learns to give. That's what God does for us. And as those made in the image and likeness of God, we are to do as God does. That's what justice looks like. Being generous to others as God is generous to us. In God's vision of the world, no one is hungry. No one is homeless. No one goes lacking in medical care. And no one gets rich by making others poor. We are called to see the world as God sees it. Moreover, we are called to join God in bringing God's vision to reality.